Welcome to this webinar on this Saturday afternoon. This webinar is how to secure your WordPress website. It's funded by the Australian Small Business Advisory Service Digital Solutions Edition. The training forms part of our Let's Get Digital initiative throughout November that we've been running, which actually ends today, being the last day of November. And my understanding is that I think this might also be the last webinar in this series as well. But I think Bertie told me if you ask nicely, you might be able to get copies of webinars that have been done throughout this month. You just need to register accordingly with your details, but just get in touch with the Business Station if you do want to go back and watch any of those webinars. So my name is Ross Minney, and I'm going to be your presenter today on this virtual online digital training. And the aim of this webinar is to try and sort of bring to light possible, I guess, threats that you might have as a business owner to your website, specifically your WordPress website, and to try and make you aware of them. And then we'll also be focusing on things that you might be able to do to hopefully mitigate a lot of these risks and threats and things that possibly might be an issue on your WordPress website. This is approximately a 1 hour webinar, depending on how we go. At the end, there will be a Q&A session that I'll be running. You'll be able to ask me all about this topic. So just hold off and make note of any questions that you have throughout the webinar. And yeah, if you do have questions, do wait till the end, but there is a specific panel inside Zoom for the Q&A section. So there's a chat section, but there's also a Q&A section too. So do try and use that wherever possible, because it makes it a lot easier to track any questions that are coming in. Cool. All right, let's get underway, guys. So hopefully this is working. Cool. So just a little bit about me. Once again, my name is Ross Minney. I've been in the IT industry for about 20 years now. I've worked for various sort of IT companies, web companies, and helping a lot of small businesses of various sizes. So I'm passionate about helping businesses to make the most of technology and to also improve their business through the use of technology. But one aspect of this is also making sure that their digital assets, and the operation of their business is protected from the types of risks that we face in today's world. So in 2006, I founded DevHouse. We developed custom software applications in the cloud for enterprise and government organizations. Shortly after launching DevHouse, I was under a bit of pressure by a lot of my customers to also provide them with IT services. So I have a business partner that operates that for the most part, but we provide day-to-day IT support, help desk, and IT consulting to small to medium enterprises. And one of the things we obviously do as part of that is helping those customers with their security requirements and making them, I guess, their business secure online and ensuring bad actors aren't able to compromise them. So I am one of the digital advisors in the Australian Small Business Advisory Services, and I also run workshops and obviously webinars such as this. So if you do want to come along to any of those, follow the IT House or DevHouse Facebook pages for more details. I've also got one-on-one availability available through the ASBAS system, which allows you to heavily government subsidized consulting on a range of topics, security being one of them. Cool. So just a little bit about the ASBAS program before we get along with things. The ASBAS program runs to 2021, and it's available for all for-profit businesses that have less than 19 employees. And the primary aim of the program is to increase the digital competency and capacity of small business owners, and to increase the number of small businesses using and making the most of digital tools and technology in their business on a day-to-day basis. Every small business ABN has access to 24 hours worth of advisory through the lifespan of the program. and a webinar such as this one counts as 1 hour towards that. The 4 areas covered by the program are listed here: the website selling online, social media and digital marketing, using small business software, and online security and data privacy, which this particular webinar happens to fit into. So if you do have any more sort of queries, or you want to find out a little bit more about the program, you can check out businessstation.com.au for more info. As I mentioned before, we provide one-on-one advisory through the program, which is charged at $40 for the first hour and then $60 for every hour after that once you've signed up. The in-person workshops are also available through the program. These are 2-hour workshops, and they're typically $30 plus GST and some fees. And you're obviously familiar with how to book for and run virtual workshops and webinars like this because you're here today. But yeah, check out businessstation.com.au for more information. Cool. So what are we doing today? So we're going to be talking a bit about why it's so important to secure your website, right? And why you should be sort of focusing on this if you are a small business owner with a WordPress website. We're going to be looking at a case study with an example of, I guess, the cost of what poor security might have to you and what it might look like for your business, I guess, if you were to be compromised. We're going to be focusing on strategies that we recommend to keep your website and your business safe when it comes to WordPress. We're going to be looking at how to actually implement that strategy, and looking at some actionable stuff that you can take away today and make your website more secure. And as I mentioned at the end, we're going to be having some question time. Cool, let's get underway. All right, so a little bit about WordPress, just so we know what we're dealing with here. We'll get some context. WordPress is the most popular website platform in the world by far. So of all the websites on the internet that use some sort of content management system, 2 out of 3 of those use WordPress. And the next highest platform behind WordPress's 60% figure is Joomla, I think, which runs about 5% of all CMSs and about 3% overall of all websites. So just by comparison to things like Squarespace and Wix, these have market shares of around 1.5% or 1.1%. So WordPress is by far the market dominator when it comes to content management systems and website platforms on the internet. All of the other platforms are very, very small fry when compared to WordPress. One of the reasons it's so popular is that it's open source. For the most part, it's community driven. A large aspect of it is completely free. And it's been totally sort of driven by people donating their time. And the problem that we have here is that because WordPress is so common and because it does have market domination, unfortunately, this does make WordPress a major target. It totally makes sense that if you're going to be targeting a certain type of website platform, you may as well target the most popular one, right? So, and the thing is, if you typically can find a vulnerability in one website, you can often find that same vulnerability in thousands or hundreds of thousands of other websites. So, and this allows them to automate the attacks and then hopefully get some sort of return on their investment in doing that. Yeah, so that's what we're dealing with, right? So you might think, all right, I'm not a target. Why would someone want to be targeting my tiny website? What exactly do I have to offer? We hear this a huge amount. The moment that we sort of start talking about security with business owners, they say, hey, I don't really have much to offer. And to be honest, we think that this couldn't be further from the truth. So if you have a website, you likely are paying for some sort of hosting. This hosting will use electricity, computing resources, and you might think this isn't sort of much, right? It's not much on its own. But as I mentioned earlier, when compromising websites, attackers often will tend to automate the process. This means they can generally take over hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of websites all at once. So this suddenly gives them a huge amount of computing sort of resources and so forth to play with. And yeah, so that's why they would be doing it. But you don't really want this happening on your website, right? Because if they do happen to do that, their activities from using your website will often be slowing down your website. And eventually your hosting company will typically catch up and work out what's going on with this, and they'll probably take down your website as their first line of defense to protect their other customers and the hosting infrastructure. So the other thing also is that your website often gives potential hackers some sort of legitimacy, right? So if your website, this can be used to compromise and manipulate the rankings of other websites, potentially. They can either intentionally or unintentionally do these sort of things. It can also be used as a platform for something called phishing. So for example, if you, and this is a far out example, if you happen to run a website on dog grooming, for example, someone could potentially compromise your website and then send out emails claiming to be some sort of related organization. So they might claim to be some sort of dog charity, for example. And this gives them some sort of credibility, but the credibility increase isn't much, but it gives scammers the ability to increase, say, their success rate from 0.01% up to 0.05%. And this means that that's a 5 times return on their investment just from taking over your website, for example. So, I mean, that's a fairly far out example, but it gives you an idea of the type of legitimacy that you might be able to give potential hackers on the internet. So the other thing also is that it gives hackers anonymity, right? So usually a lot of bad sort of activities that are done on the web are usually done with the attacker using sort of multiple levels of them having to hide who they are on the internet. And the way that they do this is often by compromising one server or one web server or one computer, and then using that to connect to another, and then using that one to connect to another computer. So before you know it, they have this sort of chain of, I guess, protection and non-immunity that they use that could be several layers deep, and your compromised WordPress website could form one of those layers. So these are the types of reasons why websites are typically targeted these days. It's not necessarily primarily to try and get personal information and so forth, although that is a risk as well. But you'll find that most of the time it's driven by these 3 big sort of reasons. Cool. So what are the consequences of sort of being compromised by for any of these sort of reasons? So there's a lot of sort of potential risks, but I'm just going to go through some of them now. One of them is that your website itself could be blacklisted in some degree. This can take a few different sort of forms, but a common one is you could be blacklisted from an email perspective. So you may not be able to send emails from your domain because your server or your domain has been blacklisted for whatever reason. So that's a huge risk that that you have. You potentially could lose authority. So if your website is compromised for some degree and you happen to, a lot of people come across that, for example, or Google indicates that you've been compromised in your search rankings, and that doesn't reflect well on your business, right? You have a loss of reputation, loss of trust in your brand. You're putting actual visitors at risk. So a lot of the infections that websites potentially could suffer can actually consequentially infect the users of the website that are visiting them. This is a little bit less common than it was in the past because browser security is much better than it has been over the years, but it is still a potential risk to some degree, just because it's not an issue at this precise point in time doesn't necessarily mean it won't be in the future. And I mentioned personal data before. That's definitely a risk. You definitely don't, even if it's just simple stuff like email addresses and so forth, you don't want those types of things being released as a result of your website being compromised. Website downtime, right? So a lot of businesses are dependent on their website being up. So you certainly don't want to be losing sales, frustrating your customers and visitors, and potentially, effectively losing future customers because your website wasn't available at the time. The website itself, you don't want to lose that. And you'll see in the case study that I'm about to bring up is that sometimes if you don't have backups and so forth, your website itself can be actually damaged, and it could be a lot of work to bring that online again. Chain reaction, I kind of mentioned that before with the visitors, but once again, a lot of these attacks that are done on websites often are done in conjunction with a lot of other, pieces of a puzzle. And you certainly don't want to be unnecessarily a piece of that puzzle causing a lot of damage to other people. And once again, it's expensive. So if you're having to sort of pay somebody to de-infect your website and so forth, and if you do have downtime, there's a lack of actual sort of tangible income. So you don't want to be having to cop that sort of stuff unnecessarily. And there's a lot of easy things that you can do. So let's have a look at this case study. So as we had a customer that came to us, and they were pretty unhappy with their existing web developers, and they were in the recreation and sport industry. So as a result, they were actually quite dependent on their website for their day-to-day operations, because they actually posted all of their times of all the games that were operating in the recreation center. So they were hosting with a fairly low-cost hosting company. As I said, they're a brick-and-mortar recreation business. They didn't have any backups in place, but they actually came to us and they said, "Oh, our site has been compromised," and because they didn't have any backups in place and they'd been compromised, we didn't really have any other choice other than to try and help them rebuild a good portion of their website and get things back online. In this particular case, we did try and get them back online as quickly as possible, and they really only had probably a day and a half of downtime, but it isn't always that way, and it's definitely not always as simple as that. So as a result, they weren't actually able to trade for an entire evening, which cost them a crap ton of money, essentially. So this gives you an idea of potentially what the risks are to a potential business, particularly if you're very dependent on that. And this is a very, very conservative sort of estimate. If you are running e-commerce sites, for example, or you have a lot more turnover on a daily basis, then it can cost you a lot of money. Cool. So question is, how do we protect ourselves? And we like to break this down into a few different areas. Firstly, we want to eliminate and just simply remove any obvious risks to the site security wherever possible, right? So if things don't need to be there, or we don't need particular plugins, we don't need sort of particular aspects of or risks, we may as well just switch them off completely and just simply not have that risk at all. For things that do need to be there, there are measures that we can do to protect ourselves. And then in addition to that, we need to make preparations so that worst case scenario, if something does, God forbid, go wrong, that we have a plan in place to work out what we're going to do and quickly recover from it to minimize any of the costs that we might have. Okay. So just going to start. Number one thing, or the biggest thing that you could possibly do to protect your website, in our opinion, is making sure that things stay up to date. So this obviously means ensuring that plugins are kept up to date on your WordPress website. Don't be using sort of, pirated plugins and things like this. Always make sure they're kept up to date. Make sure that your WordPress core is kept up to date. By far the most common way for websites to be compromised is through attacking vulnerabilities in plugins and vulnerabilities in WordPress itself that haven't yet been patched or fixed. So I can't stress this enough. Updates are hugely important, and wherever possible, you should be trying to use, WordPress does have ways of automatically updating at least security patches, but also try and keep up to date the major sort of core releases or wherever you can. Make sure you don't have too many sort of excessive users. We actually see this a lot when we're taking hosting and management over for websites, is that sometimes website owners just have a lot of old staff members still having access to the site for some reason. They might have had contractors that they've used in the past and they still have access. So just keep on top of who has access to your website. There's a users sort of folder users facility inside WordPress that you can look at, and just make sure that you can delete users that just simply don't need to be there. Frankly, this sort of, it goes for anything that's on your website. If you're not using a plugin at all on the website, you might think that that is not a risk because you're not using the plugin, whereas that's not actually true. There's a lot of examples of where plugins and themes, for example, have been compromised in some way, even though those plugins and themes are not even turned on or even active on the website. So if they are there, definitely, and you're not using them, uninstall them. And we actually go as far as to uninstall like the default themes that are not being used, for example, from packaged with WordPress. So if it's not required, get rid of it. There's no reason to have unnecessarily things, I guess, taking up space, but also providing another potential weak point in your website. So wherever possible, we always recommend changing the default admin password, not just the password, but also the actual user account itself. So don't call the admin user admin, essentially. Call it something much more unique to you and your website, and try and make it something that's not easily guessed. This isn't, once again, it's not a fix-all sort of solution, but it does make it just that slight bit harder for someone to compromise a site, or at least slightly harder to automate compromising the site. When it comes to websites, we can't sort of stress this enough as well, is that it's so important to have an SSL security certificate on your website. So the security certificate is that sort of padlock that appears in the browser in the top left. Make sure that you do have one of these. All good hosting providers do have SSL certificates included as free. Now, SSL is the thing that encrypts all of the data that flows between your website and your users, and your website and you as the admin of that website. So if you don't have encryption on that connection, then all of the data that flows backwards and forwards is in plain text, and it could be intercepted by other actors on the internet quite easily. And it's not just, you might think there's not much flowing backwards and forwards, but for example, your admin login details would be, username and password would be transmitted in plain text. So definitely make sure that you do have that installed. These days, there's no excuse for not having SSL certificates installed, because they are included as free on any good hosting provider with any good hosting. So if you're not getting a free SSL certificate and you're trying to get one installed and they're trying to charge you money for that, change hosting provider, because that definitely shouldn't be the case. To get a basic SSL certificate installed, it should be absolutely free in this day and age. The other thing also is that if you don't have those SSL certificates, Browsers are making it much more obnoxious for your users if you're not being secure. So you might notice Chrome, for example, the web browser actually says not secure in the top left now, and they're gradually just sort of making it more and more obvious when sites are not secure, and this just doesn't reflect very well on your website and your brand when your visitors are visiting and they're seeing that it's not secure. Cool. All right. What else? So a big risk to websites, and this is one of the second to sort of looking at vulnerabilities, one of the other ways that they try to get into websites is doing something what is called as a brute force attack, and that's essentially just a trial and error method of trying usernames and passwords on websites to see if they can get in, essentially. So one of the obvious ways of making sure that you can protect against this is just making sure, obviously, as I mentioned in the last slide, just making sure that your admin user is unique enough that it can't easily be guessed. But the most important thing is making sure your password is a very secure and complex password, and make sure that you haven't used that password elsewhere. It's really important to make sure that you're using unique passwords between all of the things that you're accessing. And in my opinion, you should be using some sort of password manager such as LastPass or Password One, sorry. If you do want to know a little bit more about this topic of password managers and how to manage passwords effectively, my wife and House Digital co-founder, Jo, is actually also an ASBAS advisor and did run a webinar a few days ago specifically on password security and how to manage passwords and so forth. So if you do want to get a copy of that, contact Business Station and they'll be able to provide it to you. But I would absolutely recommend making sure that passwords that you're using are secure and that you're using unique passwords wherever possible. So yeah, I mean, most of the stuff on the slide speaks for itself, I guess. Most of the time when brute force attacks are happening, initially what they'll be trying is a big list of passwords that they know are very common and they know that people use. And in addition to that, they'll be using lists of passwords from compromised locations. So there's been a range of compromised services over the years from different websites. If they've got a massive password list of hundreds of thousands of passwords from online services that have been compromised over the years, those will be the ones that they're trying to use in brute force attacks, essentially, when they're trying to log in. So that's one of the reasons why you want to have very unique passwords that you haven't used before, and why you should be using a password manager. Cool. So another thing that you can do is change your login URL. So by default, WordPress has this WP login URL. It's actually very easy to change this. We recommend, and we've used a plugin called WPS Hide Login for a number of years now. We've recently just changed because our security plugin iThemes also has just added that feature, so we don't need to use this anymore. But this is a very easy and free way to do it. It essentially changes the URL for your login, so it just makes it, once again, just another step that they need, or a hoop that they need to jump through in order to compromise your site and potentially do a brute force attack on it with usernames and passwords. So the other thing that you can do is turn off something called XML RPC. So this is also, in addition to using the login URL, XML RPC is also another way. It's kind of a backdoor way of doing a brute force attack with usernames and passwords. And in my opinion, in 95% of cases, this should actually be turned off. It does get used by some plugins. For example, if you're using the WordPress app on your phone, it does get used by the WordPress app, so you won't be able to turn it off if you are using that. It does get used by the Jetpack plugin if you happen to be using the Jetpack plugin. But they're the main two use case scenarios for XML RPC. So if you're not using either of those, then you can definitely turn it off. And frankly, in my opinion, the WordPress app isn't all that crash hot anyway. And Jetpack is really not that crash hot as well, in my opinion. So there's definitely better solutions for both of those. So in my opinion, you can turn off XML RPC. And that just reduces another weak point, I guess, in your website, one necessary weak point. Another thing that you can do on your website is turn off comments on your website. So even if there's nowhere on your website for people to actually put in comments, the function for comments is actually still enabled. And it's kind of like what I was saying with plugins before. Even though you've kind of disabled the plugin or you're not using the plugin, the code for it is there. And the same applies for disabled comments. Even though you may not have a mechanism on your front end or your interface or your website to put in comments on posts and so forth, the actual underlying code and mechanism for them often is left on a lot of the time. And the hackers will find a way to be able to post these comments on the website. And a lot of the time, this is usually used to try and convince the admin of the site to do something. It does have other ways that I guess it's used as well, but one of the most common ways that I've seen is that when comments are posted, they actually show up in the back end of your website, and essentially they're trying to convince the admin to either click on a link, or sometimes it can even tell the admin's browser to do something, even though they haven't even clicked on a link on that comment. So it's a way of them, I guess, injecting malicious code into the back end of your website when you happen to look at the comment. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to be deleting it anyway. But by that time, it's too late, and it happens to compromise the back end of the website, and they can do all sorts of other things from there. So definitely turn them off. 95 or 99% of websites don't use comments anyway. So there is a very basic plugin that you can use. I think it's just called Disable Comments. So if you want to download that plugin, just install it. It will turn off all of the aspects of comments on your website. And yeah, so the other thing also, and I must show you a screenshot here, is in the back end of the website, there's just this tick box here for anyone can register. So it is off by default, but we've come across so many different websites that we've taken over that for some reason this is turned on. And when this is turned on, it essentially allows anybody to create users, even though they might just be subscriber users that don't really have any access. That is still considered a security risk, particularly if you've got hundreds or thousands of them sort of populating the database and so forth. So definitely turn that off, because it just simply doesn't need to be on websites. Cool. Once again, you've got to make sure that you're using secure passwords. You can use a plugin to actually force the users to use strong passwords. We highly recommend doing that. A lot of the time, the security plugins that we'll recommend some towards the end of this webinar do actually have that facility in there to force the users of your website to use secure passwords. Two-factor authentication. We would always recommend two-factor authentication wherever possible. So two-factor authentication is where you use, in addition to a username and password, you use another factor. Usually it's a code that is on your mobile phone or something to that effect, to be able to log in to whatever service that you're accessing. In this case, it's your website. So I did a webinar this month specifically on more wasn't more specific, but it was more on more general computer security. And in that, I actually talked about two-factor authentication in a little bit more detail and why it's so important. But essentially, if you've got two-factor authentication, it means that even if they did have a username or password and did manage to find that out somehow, it wouldn't matter, because you need to have essentially your mobile phone sitting in front of you to be able to also log into that website. If you do want to get a copy of that webinar, once again, get in contact with Business Station. I think I did it on the 23rd of November. I think it was last weekend. So yeah, get in touch with Business Station. They'll be able to hook you up once you provide some details. So the use of security plugins, this is really important in our opinion. There are free options. There are a lot of paid options. And once again, I'll give you some recommendations on this when we sort of look at our recommended security plugin stack towards the end. And make sure that you're also choosing your hosting wisely, right? As it says here, not all hosting is created equal. And your website is only secure as the weakest link. In my opinion, there's no reason to go really cheap on hosting providers. You can get really good hosting for a reasonable price. So if you're in Australia, we recommend Venture IP, or they have another brand called Zuva, so it's Venture IP or Zuva. Kinetics is another one which is quite good, or WP Engine, which is a little bit more expensive, but they're a managed host, so they actually take care of all of your security for you, which is good. So don't sort of cheap out. I mean, Zuva in particular, I think it's like $8 a month or something like that, or even less. So there's no reason to sort of go super cheap on hosting, especially when you're hosting a website for your business. Yeah, cool. One of the questions that we commonly get is, do I need a web application firewall? And a lot of you are probably thinking, what the hell is a web application firewall? But it is becoming more and more common, and it's being, I guess, sold a lot more on the website as sort of a catch-all sort of blanket catch-all solution to security. I feel that these do have a place, particularly if you're getting a lot of traffic and have the potential to be under attack a lot of the time. And they can be great if you can afford them. But as said, if you can afford them, they are quite expensive. And as I said before, they also, in my opinion, to some degree, provide you with a false sense of security, because often people will sign up for these services or they'll install them, and then they won't do anything else on their website to try and keep it secured. So they, in my opinion, once again, they just form one piece of the puzzle. And I think that for the most part, 95% of websites, particularly in the very small business sort of area, don't necessarily need them to remain secure. So common sort of firewalls or web application firewalls are ones that are sold by places like Securi and also Cloudflare. Security does a few other things, and I'm going to be talking about them soon as well. But and so does Cloudflare. Actually, they're primarily a content delivery network, but they happen to provide a web application firewall as part of their services. A lot of premium hosts also include web application firewalls for, like WP Engine, for example. So that's why you pay a little bit more for hosting when you are looking at places like WP Engine, because they do have all these fancy sort of services bundled in with them as a managed hosting provider. But as I said before, it shouldn't be the only sort of method of security, but rather treated as like an additional layer to your overall security. So kind of like having a big fence, I guess, in addition to having your security cameras and alarm a guard dog and a really sturdy front door, right? So it just helps to have that additional big fence around it as well. Cool, moving on. So as I said, it depends. The other thing so we need to prepare, right? So if we've done all of these things and at the end of the day, we still manage to get infected, and to be honest, all of our sites are secured using essentially all of the core sort of recommendations that I've mentioned so far, and we haven't, touch wood, had any websites compromised. But if you do happen to have websites compromised, you want to have backups. And we recommend specifically having at least 2 layers of backups. So typically your website host will have their own backups, and this should form, in my opinion, the first layer. But my opinion is that you shouldn't depend on this, because those backups that the web host has typically are implemented for their benefit, or primarily their benefit, not necessarily yours. So they're usually implemented so that when their server or physical server happens to have some sort of failure, that they are able to restore from their backups when they get the physical server in the data center back online. So you should definitely look at having your own backup solution. A good free solution is something like Updraft Backups. And depending on how regularly you're changing things on your website, and whether or not you're an e-commerce website, we typically recommend backing up somewhere between daily and weekly, right? Depending on sort of how important your website is. If you have a huge dependence on the website, and you're an e-commerce and you're selling heaps of things a day on your website, then absolutely you should be backing up multiple times a day. So in the really rare case that you should have some sort of compromise or issue, it means that you can restore to the most recent copy of the website and not lose any of that transactional data that you might have throughout the day. Yeah, and to be honest, when you're having a high volume e-commerce site, you really should be looking at a paid backup solution, in our opinion. So we actually use backups that are built into the website management software that we use called Manage WP. So this does a lot of other things other than just backup, but it has a small cost. It costs us about $2 per website per month to be able to do those backups. And in addition to that, our web hosts also do backups as well. We also recommend taking an off-site backup regularly. So when websites are compromised, theoretically they have access to your website. But particularly if you're using something like Updraft for your backups, they potentially could also get access to your real-time backups, because we've got access to your website. They've compromised that, and if you're using Updraft backups, then potentially you could also access the location where those backups are going. So taking an offline backup of your website is highly recommended, depending on, once again, how important your website is to you. Maybe it might be once a month, sometimes it might be once a quarter, but make that decision yourself as to how much you're willing to risk and how much time you've got available. And once again, maybe look at, if it is that important to you, look at some sort of third-party solution, such as Manage WP, that allows you to do backups externally to the website. Cool. So what do you do if you are actually compromised? Well, it really depends, in my opinion, because there's so many different levels of being compromised. One of the most common way of websites being compromised is through some sort of automated attack, and generally they'll install some sort of malware. So this is probably 90% of the time when it's a compromised site, it'll be something along those lines. Security has a free site check facility on their website. If you just go to sitecheck.security.net, you can actually just punch your website URL into that and hit scan website. And what this does is that security's servers will go and look at your website, and it will look at heaps of different things to see whether it thinks that your website might be compromised. This isn't by no means a definitive result, because all they're looking at in this particular instance is what your website happens to be presenting to the outside world, and they're usually looking at a list of known potential vulnerabilities or signatures of a website being compromised. So if your particular website has been compromised and doesn't fit into that type of into their list of signatures or list of ways that it could be compromised, then it won't show up in the check. And it could be compromised in ways that don't necessarily show on the front end of your website as well. So this is why we recommend also having a look at the security WordPress plugin. So as I said, security do the web application firewall, and that's like a paid product, but this plugin that they have is a free plugin that you can install, and it allows you to essentially check all of the files that are on your website as part of your WordPress installation, and have them checked against what the content of those files should be. So it allows you to identify when files have been modified in your WordPress installation. And it also shows you when additional files have been added to the WordPress core that shouldn't be there as well. So I would highly recommend installing this plugin. We have this plugin installed on all of our sites, and yeah, it's very sort of easy to use. You essentially just install it, and then you can run a scan. So the benefit of this is that it's not just looking at the front end of your website like the other tool is. This is looking at all of the WordPress files on your website, and looking at, I guess, your back end as well, and all the other aspects of the website to see if it can find any compromised files. So highly recommend checking that out if you think that you've been compromised. Cool. So this is our recommended security plugin stack. So we've got two options here, a free option and a paid option. So if you don't want to spend any money, then you can look at installing WordFence security. They have a free security plugin that has a lot of features in it. And it'll have things like two-factor authentication, I think. It'll have ways to make sure that you've got secure passwords installed. It has a range of features, so it's quite mind-boggling what they've included in the free products. So definitely check that out. Once again, install the security scanner for your website. Install the WPS hide login plugin that will allow you to change your login URL so it's not as public. In terms of backups, the Updraft free is a good solution. It's one of the best in my opinion for what is a free solution. Really simple SSL. So when I was talking about SSL security certificates earlier, there's one thing to have a security certificate or SSL security certificate on your website. It's another to actually force users to use it. So what this plugin does is forces the users to always use SSL. So if it detects that a connection is not secure, then it will redirect that user to use the secure version of that URL, and just ensuring that always the data is encrypted going backwards and forwards. And then there's just the disable comments plugin there. So the paid looks very similar. You can see that we still recommend using disable comments and really simple SSL. Even security scanner, the free version is there. But what we've changed up here is we recommend iTheme Security Pro. It just has that extra level of features and so forth. And Updraft Plus Pro just gives you way more flexibility when it comes to managing your backups on a day-to-day basis. If you happen to have more than one website, you can check out Managed WP. Frankly, you can actually use Managed WP even if you have one website. And for the sake of $2 a month, yeah, it might be worth the investment to maybe have a third set of backups, frankly. So maybe you check that out. But managed WP definitely becomes useful if you are having more than one website that you're managing. So cool. All right, so where are we at? So website security is like ogres, it has layers. So there's no silver bullet, right? There's layers of protection, and doing one single action isn't magically going to protect you. Security is one of those things that has a compounding effect. You need to kind of address many different aspects of the security to make it effective. And it's not just the technical things that you do as well. It's addressing all of the sort of the human elements of security and making sure that you have the right mindset. And it's also really important to make sure that you're always educating yourself on the different possible risks as well, right? So you might be full bottle today, but hackers evolve. They always need to keep one step ahead of the game. And that means that we've just got to always be diligent and not take security for granted, right? So security is a process. It's not one sort of single action or one solution or an endpoint that we get to. It's something that we always do on an ongoing basis. Okay, so usually this is the space where I talk about upcoming workshops, but given that this is the last workshop of the month, some of the past ones that you might want to check out, and you can get in touch with Business Station if you do want to get access to them, are the top 5 ways to secure your business online. That is a very general security webinar that I did last week. And it talks about a lot of the topics that I've talked about today, but in just a little bit more detail. So the other one is keeping your password safe, and that focuses or hones in specifically on password managers like LastPass and 1Password, and it shows you how to be able to use these in your business and be able to share securely passwords with your staff members and other people that you might need to give access to things to, and also just generally how to keep your passwords secure on your computer rather than just writing them down on a book or whatever. So, or using 1Password for everything. So cool. We're at the end of the workshop, guys. So let me know if you have any questions and I'll see if I can answer them for you. Just, there is a Q&A box that is there on your Zoom interface. So John's saying, a little bit of a conspiracy theorist, I guess. So saying, I've come to suspect that antivirus security companies actually take hackers and virus developers who make money from selling the software. So, well, even if that was the case, it'd be hard for us to work out if that is definitely the case. I mean, I guess the thing is that if that were true, and to be honest, I don't think it is, even if it was to be true, there's still a lot more resources that would be outside of their control, creating potential or trying to come up with vulnerabilities for existing software. So the thing with WordPress anyway is it is an open source platform. So if it was true that they were actively creating vulnerabilities in the software, surely it would be very easy to track that type of activity in the actual code base of WordPress over time. Given that every code update in WordPress is pretty much public. So yeah, it's hard for me to comment on something like that, I guess, but yeah, I doubt very much that particularly security, I wouldn't imagine that they would, I mean, at the moment that something like that would come out, I mean, they would have to have a team of developers creating vulnerabilities and so forth, and then they would have to fund that and somehow keep it secret. And I find that very unlikely, particularly when all of the WordPress code is publicly available and you can track every change to its code base anyway. So I think it's unlikely. Do we have any other questions, guys? I've just got a follow-up question there, John, about membership. Are you able to just clarify what your query is there? Are you talking about the allow users to subscribe? Is that what you're referring to? Like in an e-commerce situation? Yeah. So one situation where you do need, you're right, one of the situations where you do need to have that allow users to subscribe function turned on is when you're running a WooCommerce site. So obviously keep that in mind. It's probably something I should have touched on through the webinar. If you do have a WooCommerce site, don't be just turning that particular feature off without just knowing what the implications are going to be of it, because WooCommerce is dependent on that particular feature. So there are other ways of trying to lock that down. Probably a little bit too much for me to go into in this particular webinar. But I have had, unfortunately, I have had WooCommerce sites that have been a victim of mass sort of user subscriptions before. So that's its own challenge within itself. So cool. Thanks, guys. Any other questions? It sounds like everybody. Yeah, it's pretty common. So yeah, essentially just having sites compromised and having them redirected to websites where they sell questionable products. Yeah, and you're right, John. The comments is a common way of doing that. We've seen it a few times. There has been some vulnerability. I think they've been patched recently, but there has been some vulnerabilities in WordPress in the past where when a comment does come through and then you don't even need to click on a link that's in the comment. I think they embed some JavaScript or something into the actual comment itself, and when you go when you view that comment in the back end, it I think creates an admin user or something. So yeah, it is a risk. That would be one. If you do need to have the comments turned on the website, then that definitely the I'm Not a Robot, which is the Google reCAPTCHA facility, that would definitely help. It wouldn't solve it completely, but it would definitely help, particularly if the attacks are often coming from actual users. So if it's not an automated attack and they are targeting, or they're paying, I don't know, somebody $2 an hour to manually go and sort of comment on websites with these infections. So it wouldn't actually stop that, unfortunately. Definitely check out Akismet. I think that's installed by default on WordPress still. And so Akismet does check comments against common sources of spam and so forth. So if it's seeing the same types of comments across multiple websites, then that's something that the Akismet plugin will address. So cool. All right. Yeah, correct. Yeah, Akismet. Any other questions, guys and gals? No worries, John. Thank you for being here. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. If you do want to, once again, check out our social media for House Digital or IT House, feel free to get in touch with us, or check us out on businessstation.com.au if you are looking to take advantage of any of the other facilities offered through the ASBAS program. I'll leave you with it. Take care.